Alright, so we need to learn how to get files between different systems. And the way we are going to learn how to do that is using the SCP command. We don't really need this yet in this class, but later on we're going to need it. So we're going to start learning it now because historically speaking, students struggle with using this command to move files between systems. So we're going to get a head start on learning how to use it, and we're going to use it to get the password for the quiz exercises quiz this week. So I'll give you the exact command for how to do that later on. But first, we're going to go over some general SCP related knowledge. So SCP is secure copy. It is part of SSH. It's built in with SSH, so it exists on almost all Linux and Unix systems that have SSH running. Basically, if we remember that when we want to copy files on a local system, we copy and then we supply a source and a destination to copy that file. Sometimes the destination, we can put a dot to mean the current directory. So with SCP, we're going to have similar things. We're just going to have SCP for secure copy, and we need a source and we need a destination. So this is going to work very similar to copy, except one of these two items will be a remote source or a remote destination. So right now I'm on my Mac. I have a file called test file. So I'm going to copy test file. You can follow along and practice this if you want. Just make yourself a file called test file and put it in your current directory. I'm going to copy test file, and I want to copy it to CNT serve. So we need to specify a username. I'm going to use my test username. We need an @ sign, and then we need the host name or IP address of the system we want to copy it to. And then we put a colon. Colon's important. If you don't put the colon, it's going to make a local copy of the file called rbe11111@cntserve.hack.edu. So the colon is very important. This is a complete and functional SCP command that will copy a test file to CNTserve as my user, and then it will keep the same name for my user. So I'm going to go ahead and run this command. It's asking me for a passphrase. It's not going to ask you for a passphrase yet. We'll get to that later. You need to put your password. Like I said, you will not get asked for a passphrase at this point. And apparently I don't have a file called test file. Oh, it's test_file. So let's do that again. Error, no such file or directory. So that meant I didn't have that file. It was test_file, my mistake. So now I'll put my password, and it copies it up. So if I go over to CNTserve, in this shell, I'm already logged into CNTserve with my user. So if I do ls, I now have my file called test file. So that's the simplest SCP copy. We can also change the name when we upload it. So I'm going to call it new file this time. New file. Now if we go look on the system, I have new file. We can also supply a directory. So in this case I have a files directory, so I can put my new file in the files directory. Files directory, new file. So now if I look in the files directory, I have new file in the files directory. So that's copying a file up, and notice that we put a relative path in our command, meaning we did not specify an absolute path starting at the root of the file system. When you put a relative path, that is relative to your home directory. So if we look at the location I'm in my home directory. So this first command just put it in my home directory. This command put it in my home directory and called it new file. And this command put it in the directory called files within my home directory and called it new file. If I wanted to use an absolute path, I could do that. There's really no reason to use an absolute path if you are going to your home directory. But I'll do that just for demonstration purposes. I'm not going to put my key because you don't have a key yet. So now I used a full path, and I have new file 2. So if you need to put the file somewhere other than your home directory, like say if I wanted to write to Etsy, you need to be writing to a place you have permission to write to. I do not have permission to write to Etsy, so I'm going to get an error for this. Permission denied. So if I wanted to copy that file to temp, I could do that because I have permission to write to temp. So if we look at the commands I ran and summarize, I ran and copied it without and got an error. I ran and it worked and kept the same name. I ran it and it copied and changed the name. I ran it and it put it in a directory with a new name. I ran it with a full path, absolute path. I ran it with an absolute path to a place I couldn't write, and then I ran it with a absolute path to a place I could write. So that's most of the things you need to know about copying a file to a remote system. Another thing we want to be able to do, is copy a file from a remote system. And in that case, if we look at our last command, we had a local source and a remote destination. Well, now we want to change that to have a remote destination and a local source. Sorry, a remote source and a local destination. I had that backwards. So if we look at my remote directory on CNTServe, I have a file called testfile2, and I'm going to copy from CNTServe as the RBE11111 user testfile2, and I'm going to copy it to my local directory. I just put a dot. You can do all those things. We can do a copy about putting a new name, putting in a directory, all those things. I'm not going to do that this time. I'm just going to show you we're copying from a remote user on a remote system, and we specify the file name and where we want to put it, local directory, current directory. So now I've copied testfile2 down to my local system. So like I said, we will need this quite frequently when we get to the administration portion of the course. However, I found that if we start earlier in learning how to do it, we usually have better results. So for this week's exercises quiz, you need to use SCP to get the password for that quiz. So if we look at the instructions, it tells you, okay, use SCP to copy this file from this remote system as this remote user. So if you look at those instructions, the remote user I've given you is called SCP. The remote system is 192.168.240.102. And the remote file name is mod3pw. And we want to copy it to the current directory. So we are running this file from CNTServe. I'm in my home directory. You need to be someplace you have permission to write, so you probably want to be in your home directory. SCP command, this is the user, IP address of the remote system, remote file, and then the dot for current directory. It's going to ask me for the password. The password is listed in the quiz instructions. Oh, that's asking me for a passphrase. You won't get asked for a passphrase. The password is listed in the quiz instructions. And now I have successfully copied that file down, and I can use the cat command to display the contents of that file, which I'm not going to do because then you would see the password. So once you get the file down, you can use cat to see the password, and then you can put that in desire to learn to get into the quiz so you can take the quiz.